The cold woke me before the fear. Inside my Honda Civic, the air matched the frost outside. I huddled under blankets, but the memories found me. My family's betrayal left me homeless at 47. "I always knew you'd fail," my mother said. Sleeping in my car, I tried to hold my life together until a cop ran my license and froze. "Sir, there's a federal flag on your file from 1988. Homeland Security wants your location." When he showed me the reason, my hands started shaking. Before the officer spoke, there was just the light. A sharp beam sliced through the condensation on my window, dragging me from sleep. My heart slammed against my ribs. For a second, I didn't think it was the police. I thought it was her again. My mother coming to inspect my misery, to verify her prediction had come true. I scrambled upright, knocking a water bottle to the floorboard. The sound echoed like a gunshot, making the shadow outside flinch. "License and registration," the voice demanded. I rolled the window down, letting the freezing air bite my face. My fingers were stiff claws as I fumbled through the glove compartment, pushing aside napkins. I expected a ticket. Another fine I couldn't pay. Another mark against a credit score my brother Julian had already incinerated. I handed over my worn ID, trying to keep my hands steady. The officer snatched it, retreating to his cruiser. Swirling blue lights painted the parking lot in a nauseating rhythmic strobe. I watched him in the rearview mirror. He sat hunched over his computer, looking bored. Then, his posture changed. He leaned closer to the screen, squinting. He typed rapidly, stopped, and typed again. The boredom vanished, replaced by rigid tension. He reached for his radio, speaking with an urgency that made my stomach turn. He wasn't writing a ticket anymore. He was calling for backup. I looked around the empty lot, suddenly aware of how defenseless I was. He stepped out, hand hovering near his holster. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," he ordered. His voice was tight. I opened the door and stumbled onto the asphalt, legs numb. "Keep your hands visible." I raised my palms, showing him I held nothing but fear. "What did I do?" I asked. "Is it the parking?" He didn't answer. He kept his distance, treating me like a loaded weapon instead of a homeless man in a faded hoodie. He looked at me with wide eyes, not seeing a vagrant, but seeing a ghost. That was when he told me about the flag. The words hung in the freezing air, impossible to process. 1988. I was just a kid then. Years before my mother stopped loving me or Julian stole my identity. The officer lowered his hand but didn't relax. "Dispatch is patching through to a federal agent," he said. "It's a priority 1 alert." He turned the screen toward me. It wasn't a criminal record. It was a protective order, buried deep in the system, waiting for my life to collapse. The digital clock on the cruiser dashboard pulsed a steady neon red, mocking the slow passage of time. My hands remained up, locked in a position of surrender that had become my permanent emotional state. The officer, whose badge read Ramirez, stayed 5 feet back, his shadow stretching long across the frost-covered asphalt of the abandoned Walmart lot. He kept his eyes fixed on me, yet he seemed to be looking through me at something much older. The air smelled of salt and old exhaust, a scent that always signaled the end of my endurance. He didn't move to cuff me. Instead, he waited for the ghosts of 1988 to finalize their long-delayed arrival. I felt the first true tremors of a deep, bone-shaking chill. A low hum vibrated through the ground, growing into the heavy rumble of a diesel engine approaching from the north. 2 black SUVs cut through the gloom, their headlights blinding as they swung in to block my battered Civic. They didn't use sirens, which felt far more ominous than a loud arrival. Men in tactical vests stepped out with a practiced, lethal efficiency that made Ramirez look like an amateur. One woman walked toward me, her heels clicking against the frozen ground with rhythmic precision. She wore a dark trench coat that caught the wind, making her look like a predatory bird. She stopped just outside the pool of light. Her eyes were sharp, scanning my face for a resemblance I hadn't yet claimed. "Xavier, I am Agent Vance," she said, her voice dropping like lead into the silence. She held a heavy tablet that glowed with a frantic blue light. I lowered my hands slowly, my shoulders screaming from the tension of the last few minutes. I wanted to ask about the flag, but my throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. She stepped closer, invading my personal space without hesitation. She didn't look at my tattered clothes or the grease under my fingernails with disgust. Instead, she looked at me with a strange, professional pity that was far harder to stomach than my mother's open contempt. She turned the tablet toward me, showing a grainy photograph of a man I once loved. The man in the photo was my Uncle Ethan, standing tall in a crisp military uniform. He was smiling, his eyes holding a warmth that had been missing from my life for decades. Seeing his face felt like a physical blow to my chest, stealing my breath. He was a defense contractor, Xavier, Vance explained, her voice softening just enough to be dangerous. He didn't die in an accidental gas leak. He was executed because he found a hole in the national security net. My vision blurred as the lie I had lived for 38 years began to dissolve. My mother had told me Ethan was reckless and careless. She had used his death to warn me against ever taking risks. Vance tapped the screen, and a timeline of my recent financial collapse appeared in stark, unfeeling bar graphs. The flag was a distress signal, a dead man's switch tied to your social security number, she continued. It triggers if you ever fall below the poverty line or lose your permanent address. I stared at the data, seeing the exact moment my life had been dismantled by those I trusted. The identity theft wasn't just greed from my brother Julian. It was a calculated move to push me into the very state of emergency Ethan had feared. They wanted me broken and invisible so that the secret of 1988 would stay buried in the dirt. My family had engineered my homelessness to protect a killer. Why me? I whispered, my voice cracking in the cold night air. I felt small against the backdrop of federal agents and high-stakes conspiracies. Vance reached out, her gloved hand steadying my arm as I swayed on my feet. Because you were the only witness, Xavier. You were 7 years old, sitting in the back of his car when the warehouse went up. The memory flared in the back of my mind like a dying ember suddenly kicked into life. I remembered the smell of ozone and the sound of metal tearing. I remembered a man with a heavy ring on his finger leaning into the window. He hadn't seen me hiding under a blanket. He had only seen Ethan. The weight of the realization crushed my remaining defenses. I had spent 47 years believing I was a failure because my mother had repeated it like a holy mantra. Every mistake I made was framed as proof of my inherent weakness. Now I saw the truth through the lens of Vance's cold, hard evidence. I wasn't a failure. I was a liability that needed to be managed. My mother's cruelty was a defensive wall built to keep me from looking back at the flames of 1988. She had traded my future for her own safety, selling my credit and my dignity to the men who killed her brother. A hot, sharp surge of white, hot anger finally replaced the cold. I need to see her, I said, my voice gaining a steady, dangerous edge. I looked at my car, then at the sleek SUVs surrounding me. I was done hiding in the shadows of parking lots and side streets. Vance nodded, her expression unreadable, but seemingly satisfied with my reaction. We've already tracked her location. She's at the house in Denver, probably celebrating your disappearance with your brother. She signaled to her team, and the agents began to move with renewed purpose. They didn't treat me like a victim anymore. They treated me like a key that was finally being inserted into a lock. I climbed into the back of the SUV, leaving my life behind. The interior of the vehicle was silent, insulated from the world by thick glass and armored plating. I watched the blurred lights of the city streak by, feeling like a passenger in someone else's nightmare. Vance sat across from me, her tablet still humming with data. Julian and your mother have been receiving monthly payments from a shell company for years, she noted. It was blood money, Xavier. They were being paid to keep you quiet and keep you poor. I closed my eyes, picturing the Sunday dinners I had attended, begging for a loan or a kind word. They had sat there, eating expensive steaks, while I wondered if I could afford my next tank of gas. Every backhanded compliment and every sigh of disappointment from my mother flashed through my mind. She had played the role of the long-suffering parent perfectly, garnering sympathy from the neighbors while she bled me dry. She had convinced everyone that I was the problem, the black sheep who couldn't hold a steady job. In reality, she was the one pulling the threads of my life, ensuring every bridge I built was burned before I could cross it. The psychological brilliance of her plan was terrifying. By convincing me I was a loser, she ensured I would never trust my own memories. I had been my own jailer, fueled by her lies. The SUV turned onto the familiar tree-lined street where I had grown up. The houses were large and suburban, glowing with the warmth of families who didn't betray their own. We pulled up to my mother's driveway, the beige siding of the house looking pristine under the streetlights. A silver Mercedes sat in the driveway, Julian's newest toy bought with the interest on my stolen soul. I felt a sick twist in my gut, but I didn't hesitate. I stepped out of the SUV before the agent could open the door. The grass was crisp under my boots, the sound echoing in the quiet neighborhood. I was home, but I wasn't the prodigal son. Vance walked beside me, her hand resting near her weapon as we approached the front door. "Let me do the talking initially," she whispered, but I barely heard her. I reached out and pressed the doorbell, the chimes echoing inside with a cheerful mocking sound. I could hear footsteps light and hurried. The door swung open, and my mother stood there, her hair perfectly styled even at this late hour. She looked at me, her eyes widening in a split second of genuine shock before the mask of disappointment snapped back into place. "Xavier, what on earth are you doing here at this hour? You look absolutely pathetic." I didn't answer her. I simply stepped past her into the foyer, my boots leaving muddy tracks on her expensive Persian rug. She gasped, her hand flying to her throat as she noticed the dark figures of the agents behind me. Julian appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of scotch. He looked down at me with a smirk that didn't quite reach his terrified eyes. "Back for a handout, little brother. I told you, the well is dry." He stopped when he saw Agent Vance's badge gleaming in the entryway light. The glass in his hand trembled, the ice clinking against the crystal. "Homeland Security," Vance announced, her voice echoing through the house like a thunderclap. My mother retreated into the living room, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. "There must be a mistake," she stammered, clutching the back of a floral armchair. "My son is a vagrant. He's had some trouble with the law, but we have nothing to do with it." I stepped toward her, the space between us shrinking until she was forced to look up at me. "The flag from 1988 found me, Mom. It told me everything you've been hiding." Her eyes darted to the window, looking for an exit that didn't exist anymore. Julian descended the stairs slowly, his bravado leaking away with every step. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes flitting between the agents and his mother. "We didn't kill Ethan," he blurted out, the confession hanging in the air before anyone had even accused him. Linda hissed at him to be quiet, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. I realized then that she didn't feel guilt. She only felt the terror of being caught. She had lived a lie so long that she had become the lie. She looked at me, her lips curling into a final, desperate snarl of hatred. "You should have stayed in the car, Xavier," she whispered, her voice cold enough to freeze blood. "You were always the weak one. You were always going to be the one to ruin everything." I looked at her and felt nothing but a profound, cleansing sense of relief. The cage was open, and the bird had finally realized it could fly. Vance stepped forward, holding a pair of handcuffs that caught the light. "Linda Dawson, you are under arrest for conspiracy and obstruction of justice." As they led her away, she didn't look back. I stood in the center of the ruins, finally understanding the true cost of the truth. The handcuffs clicked with a finality that echoed through the marble foyer. My mother didn't struggle. She simply went stiff, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. Julian was already being ushered out the door, his silk robe flapping in the winter wind. I stood among the remnants of their high-class life, feeling like an intruder in my own past. The scent of expensive candles and floor wax felt suffocating. Agent Vance watched me closely. She knew the real work was just beginning for us. I walked toward the kitchen, my boots clicking on the polished tile. I needed a glass of water to wash away the copper taste of adrenaline. On the counter sat a framed photo of our last family Christmas. I looked happy, or at least I was trying to look the part. Now I saw the shadows under my eyes and the way Julian stood just a bit too far away. They had already been planning my ruin. They were smiling while I was drowning. Vance followed me, her footsteps silent compared to my heavy tread. She held out a small, encrypted drive she had pulled from Julian's desk. "This contains the ledger for the last decade," she said. "It shows exactly how they diverted your earnings and used your name to secure the offshore accounts." I took the drive, its cold metal casing vibrating with the secrets of my betrayal. It was light, Yet it felt like it weighed 100 pounds in my palm. "Why me?" I asked, my voice a hollow rasp. I leaned against the granite island, staring at my reflection in the stainless steel appliances. Vance pulled up a chair and sat across from me. "Because a dead man is an investigation," she replied. "A homeless, discredited failure is a ghost. Nobody listens to ghosts, Xavier. They wanted you alive, but silenced." Her logic was a cold blade. It cut through the last of my illusions about family loyalty. I realized then that my mother's constant insults were a tactical necessity. By eroding my self-worth, she ensured I would never have the confidence to question the discrepancies in my life. If I felt like a loser, I would act like one. I would accept the scraps she threw me and never look for the feast she stole. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. She hadn't just taken my money. She had attempted to delete my very soul to protect herself. A sudden movement in the hallway caught my eye. One of the agents was carrying a box of files from the basement. A loose sheet of paper fluttered to the floor near my feet. I bent down to retrieve it, expecting a bank statement or a receipt. Instead, I saw a hand-drawn map of the old warehouse district. It was dated 3 days ago. There were red circles around a specific dock. My pulse quickened as I recognized the handwriting. It wasn't my mother's. I showed the map to Vance, my hand trembling slightly. She stood up instantly, her professional mask tightening into a grimace. "This belongs to the man with the ring," I whispered. He wasn't just paying them. He was still meeting them here. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The threat wasn't over just because my family was in chains. The man who killed my uncle was still in the city, and according to the map, he was waiting for a final pickup tonight. Vance gripped the map, her thumb tracing the red ink. "If he is waiting, we go now," she stated. I felt a surge of cold terror, but I nodded. The warehouse district was a graveyard of rusted steel and broken promises. We ran back to the black SUV, the engine already turning over. I left the porch light on, a final beacon for a life I no longer wanted. My mother was gone. Now I wanted the man who started the fire. The drive was a blur of wet pavement and flickering street lamps. Vance checked her sidearm with a metallic click. I watched her hands, steady and sure, and felt my own inadequacy. I was a man who slept in a car, yet I was hunting a ghost. "You stay behind me," Vance warned. I didn't argue. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. We pulled into the shadows of Dock 14. The silence was heavy and thick. We stepped out into the biting wind. The smell of the river was sharp, mixed with rotting wood. The warehouse loomed ahead, a dark mountain of corrugated iron. A single light flickered above a heavy steel door. Vance signaled for her team to fan out. I stayed low, my boots crunching on gravel. Every shadow seemed to reach for me. I remembered this smell. It was the scent of 1988. I felt the heat of the old fire on my face. Inside, the air was stagnant and cold. Dust danced in our flashlight beams. Vance moved with a fluid grace, her weapon leading the way. We passed stacks of wooden crates, their labels faded and torn. I saw a movement near a stack of oil drums. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my feet were leaden. Then, a voice cut through the dark. It was low, gravelly, and hauntingly familiar. It was the voice from the car window. "You were always a stubborn child, Xavier," the voice said. A man stepped into a patch of moonlight. He was old now, his hair silver, but the ring on his hand caught the light. It was a heavy, gold band with a dark stone. He didn't look afraid of the federal agents. He looked bored. He held a small remote in his left hand. I realized then that the warehouse wasn't empty. It was rigged. He had been expecting us to arrive. Vance leveled her gun at his chest. "Drop it." "Miller," she commanded. The man just smiled, a thin line of white teeth. He looked at me, his eyes cold and hollow. "Your uncle thought he could save the world," he whispered. "He only managed to burn himself." I felt the anger boil over, hot and sharp. I took a step forward, ignoring Vance's silent order to stay back. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to see the ghost. Miller laughed, a dry sound like dead leaves. "You think this ends with a pair of cuffs?" he asked. He pressed a button on the remote, and a low hum started beneath our feet. A series of red lights began to pulse along the walls. My blood turned to ice. He wasn't planning an escape. He was finishing what he started 38 years ago. Vance lunged for him, but a heavy crate tipped, blocking her path. The man vanished into the deep shadows. The red pulse against the walls felt like a countdown in my veins. Miller's laughter echoed, fading into the maze of rusted shelving and hollow crates. Vance struggled against the fallen wood, her shoulder hitting the heavy timber with a dull thud. I didn't wait for her orders this time. I ran toward the sound of Miller's retreating footsteps. The air grew thick with the smell of old chemicals and rising heat. My boots skidded on slick, oil-stained concrete floors. I ducked behind a row of industrial lockers as a blast of steam hissed from a nearby pipe. The humming beneath the floor intensified, a mechanical growl that shook my teeth. I saw Miller near a secondary exit, his silver hair gleaming under a flickering bulb. He wasn't running anymore. He was checking a panel wired directly into the warehouse mains. He looked up and saw me. His eyes didn't show fear. They held a twisted, dark sort of pride. "You really are Ethan's blood," Miller shouted over the mounting roar. He reached into his coat and pulled a secondary device. It was a heavy military-grade detonator. I realized he wasn't just blowing the building. He was wiping the entire block to erase the evidence once and for all. Vance finally broke through the debris behind me, her weapon raised. She fired a warning shot that pinged off a steel beam. Miller didn't flinch. He simply smiled at me. I noticed a heavy iron wrench sitting atop a nearby workbench. My hand closed around the cold, rusted metal. It felt solid and real in a world made of ghosts and lies. I didn't think about the risk or my mother's voice. I threw the tool with every ounce of my suppressed rage. It struck the control panel, sparking a bright blue arc of electricity. Miller screamed as the surge threw him backward. The pulsating red lights suddenly turned a steady, blinding amber. The hum shifted in pitch, becoming a frantic, high-pitched whine. Miller groaned on the floor, his hand clutching his scorched chest. Vance moved in, kicking the detonator away before pinning him down. "It's over, Miller," she barked, clicking her cuffs onto his wrists. I stood over him, my chest heaving, watching the light die in his eyes. He looked at the sparking panel and laughed. "The override is manual, Xavier," he wheezed. "You just locked the doors from the outside." My heart stopped as I heard the heavy deadbolts slide home across the warehouse. We were trapped in a cage of our own making. Vance grabbed her radio, but only static barked back. The electrical surge had fried our communications. The amber light began to smoke, turning a deep, bruised purple. I looked at the exit, then back at Miller. He had anticipated this failure. He had rigged the system to ensure no one left the dock alive tonight. Vance began to hammer on the steel door with the butt of her pistol. The sound was hollow and useless against the reinforced plating. I looked at the sparking wires and felt a strange, calm clarity. My uncle had hidden something here for a reason. I remembered the red wire from my dream. I scanned the floor and saw a small, hidden hatch near the oil drums. It wasn't an exit. It was a fuse box. Someone was already moving inside. The hatch creaked open as a small, wiry figure emerged from the shadows. It was a technician I had seen at the design firm months ago. He held a wire cutter and a handheld terminal that pulsed with a rhythmic green glow. He didn't look at Miller or the agents. His eyes were fixed on the fuse box near the oil drums. I realized then that the conspiracy had roots deeper than my own family. The firm wasn't just my employer, it was a front. "Move away from the panel," the man hissed. He didn't have a gun, but he had the only way out of the deadlocked warehouse. Vance adjusted her aim, her finger tightening on the trigger. The purple light grew blinding, casting long, distorted shadows against the corrugated walls. The heat was becoming unbearable now. My skin felt tight and dry. I watched the technician work with a frantic, desperate speed. He was trying to bypass the manual lockout I had accidentally triggered. "He is not helping us, Xavier," Vance warned quietly. She stepped back, keeping her weapon leveled at both Miller and the new arrival. The technician ignored her, his fingers dancing across the terminal. A sudden spark flew from the fuse box, lighting up his face. He looked terrified. The warehouse began to groan as the internal pressure built toward a catastrophic release. I looked at the oil drums and realized they weren't empty. They were filled with high-grade accelerant intended for the final blast. The technician managed to pop the cover off the primary relay. He reached inside, his hand shaking violently. "If I cut the red lead, the bolts might retract," he shouted over the roar of the machinery. I remembered the red wire from my dreams again. It wasn't a memory of a bomb. It was a memory of Ethan trying to fix a similar trap. My uncle hadn't been a victim of the explosion. He had been the one trying to stop it. "Wait, don't cut it!" I yelled. The technician froze, his blade inches from the copper. I lunged forward, sliding across the slick floor to grab his wrist. "The red wire is the secondary trigger," Ethan told me. The man stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He didn't know who I was, but he saw the conviction in my face. Vance moved closer, her flashlight illuminating the complex web of colored strands inside the box. We were seconds away from total incineration. I took the cutters from the man's limp hand. My vision was blurring from the smoke, but the red wire seemed to glow with a malevolent light. I looked for the ground wire, the one Ethan had mentioned in his last letter. I saw a thin, black strand tucked behind the main power bus. It was dusty and nearly invisible. If I missed, we would all become part of the warehouse floor. I felt a strange, cold calm wash over my tired body. I clipped the black wire. The high-pitched whine stopped instantly, replaced by a heavy, mechanical silence. The purple light faded to a dull, flickering orange. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, the heavy deadbolts on the main door slid back with a series of loud, metallic clanks. Fresh, freezing air rushed into the building, clearing the smoke. I slumped against a stack of crates, the cutters falling from my numb fingers. We were alive, but the silence felt heavy. Vance didn't waste a second. She grabbed the technician and shoved him toward the exit, where her backup was already arriving. Miller lay on the floor, his breathing shallow and ragged. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "You found it," he wheezed. "The failed safe." I didn't answer him. I just watched the agents swarm the building, their boots echoing like thunder. The nightmare was finally ending, but the cost was etched into the charred walls around me. As the paramedics loaded Miller into an ambulance, Vance walked over to me. She was covered in soot, her face a mask of exhaustion. "You did well, Xavier," she said. She handed me a small, scorched notebook she had found near the relay. It was Ethan's. I opened the brittle pages and saw my own name written in the margins. He had planned for this day. He had known I would be the one to return to the fire to put it out. I walked out into the cold night air, breathing deeply. The sky was beginning to turn a pale, bruised gray as dawn approached. My car was still parked in the distance, a relic of a life I no longer occupied. I looked at the black SUVs and the flashing lights. I wasn't the homeless failure my mother had created. I was the man who survived the warehouse twice. But as I turned to leave, Vance grabbed my arm. "The ledger is missing a page." Vance gripped my arm with a strength that betrayed her calm exterior. The missing page from the ledger was more than a clerical error. It was a roadmap to the real architect. I stared at the scorched notebook in my hand, feeling the weight of its secrets. The smoke from the warehouse still clung to my clothes, a bitter reminder of the near-death escape. If the ledger was incomplete, then Miller was just a middleman. Someone else was still holding the reins of my life. We moved toward the command vehicle, the gravel crunching under our boots. Inside, the screens were alive with shifting data points and facial recognition scans. Vance pointed to a blurred silhouette captured by a traffic camera 3 blocks away. It was a man in a tailored suit, his hand resting on the door of a silver Mercedes. I recognized the car instantly. It belonged to Julian, but the man driving it was not my brother. The driver wore a heavy gold signet ring. The realization hit me like a physical punch to the stomach. Julian had been more than a pawn, he was a liaison. He had lent his car to the very man who had ordered our deaths. My brother hadn't just stolen my credit, he had actively facilitated the hunt. I looked at Vance, my eyes burning with a new, sharper kind of rage. "They are going to the design firm," I whispered. "That is where the backup servers are hidden." We had to move. The drive was a frantic dash through the waking city streets. Vance drove with a lethal focus, weaving through the early morning delivery trucks. I checked the cylinder of the spare revolver she had tucked into my hand. It felt cold and indifferent. We pulled up to the glass-fronted offices of my former life. The lobby was dark, but a single elevator light was ascending toward the executive floor. The man with the ring was already inside our fortress of secrets. We bypassed the main entrance, using a service stairwell that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. My lungs burned as we climbed the 15 flights in silence. Vance held her breath. her weapon leading the way as we reached the heavy steel door. I could hear the rhythmic clicking of a high-speed keyboard from within the server room. Someone was wiping the data. They were erasing the evidence of 38 years of state-sponsored theft and betrayal. I kicked the door open, the sound echoing through the sterile, white-tiled hallway. The man at the terminal didn't flinch. He turned slowly, his face etched with a terrifying, calm confidence. It was the CEO of the design firm, the man who had hired me 3 years ago. He looked at my tattered clothes and smiled with genuine amusement. "You were a good project manager, Xavier," he said. "It is a shame you had to find the flag." He held a flash drive. Vance leveled her pistol at his head. "Step away from the console, Sterling," she commanded. Sterling just laughed, a soft sound that chilled me to the bone. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a man who owned the world. He tapped the signet ring against the metal desk, a rhythmic, taunting pulse. He had been the one paying my mother all those years. He had been the one who turned my family into a pack of wolves. "The police are downstairs," I said, my voice steady despite the shaking in my chest. Sterling looked at the flash drive and then back at me. "The police work for the people who sign the checks, Xavier. You should know that by now." He pressed a final key on the laptop, and the server racks began to beep in a frantic, dying sequence. He was destroying the ledger in real time. Everything Vance had worked for was vanishing into the digital ether. I lunged forward, not for Sterling, but for the power cables beneath the desk. My hands found the thick, braided copper and I yanked with every ounce of my remaining strength. The room plunged into darkness as the servers died a sudden, silent death. Sterling lunged for me, his signet ring catching the light as he swung a heavy fist. I ducked, the metal whistling past my ear. Vance fired, the muzzle flash illuminating the room in a brief, violent strobe. Sterling fell, clutching his shoulder as the drive skittered across the floor. I scrambled after it, my fingers closing around the plastic casing just as the lobby alarms began to scream. We had the data, but the building was now a cage. I looked out the window and saw 3 black sedans pulling up, blocking the exits. They weren't federal vehicles. They belonged to the firm's private security. We were trapped on the top floor with no way out. The sirens below sang a different tune than the engines approaching the roof. Sterling lay groaning, but his eyes remained fixed on the door. "You think you won?" he wheezed, clutching his shoulder. Vance dragged me toward the service elevator. It was dead. We were trapped 15 stories up with a flash drive and a bleeding billionaire. The private security teams were not here to negotiate. They were here to sanitize the site. I felt the building vibrate as the first team entered. We retreated toward the executive balcony, the wind howling against the glass. The city stretched out below, indifferent to the war in this penthouse. Vance checked her magazine. "One left," she whispered. I looked at the flash drive, then at the gray sky. My mother's voice finally faded, replaced by the heavy rhythmic thumping of a helicopter. It wasn't ours. The dark bird hovered, its spotlight blinding us. They weren't looking for Sterling. They were aiming a sniper rifle at the data. I pushed Vance behind a marble pillar just as a bullet shattered the glass. Shards rained down like diamonds, cutting my cheek. The pressure was absolute. I looked at the drive, then at the heavy gold ring on Sterling's hand. He wasn't just the CEO. He was the man from the 1988 car window. He had aged, but the cruelty was identical. I realized my life wasn't destroyed by accident. It was a long, cold game of cat and mouse. He smiled. "Throw it over," Sterling commanded, his voice steady despite the pain. I stood up, ignoring the spotlight and the wind. I didn't feel like a homeless failure anymore. I felt like the witness I was born to be. I didn't throw the drive to him. Instead, I held it over the edge of the balcony. The helicopter dipped, the pilot hesitant. They couldn't risk the drop. For the first time, I held the power. I saw the fear in Sterling's eyes. Vance seized the moment, using her last round to take out the spotlight. The world plunged into a chaotic, strobe-lit shadow. I didn't drop the drive. I shoved it into my boot and vaulted over the railing onto the window washer's rig. It was a desperate, vertical gamble. The rig groaned, sliding down the side of the steel tower. Bullets sparked off the metal above me. I was falling, but I was finally in control. I saw the ground rushing up. The rig slammed into the 4th-floor ledge, jarring my teeth. I rolled through an open window into a quiet hallway. Federal sirens finally drowned out the private security. Vance was somewhere above, but the data was with me. I walked out the front door, blending into the crowd of morning commuters. I looked at my reflection in a lobby mirror. I wasn't the ghost they created. I was the man who survived, but my phone buzzed with an unknown text.